Hi, I'm Brian English, Wappler Forum name Hyperbytes. In this module, we're going to just step away for a moment from our core theme of our community web. And this is going to be a more generic module where we're going to discuss joins, subtables, and multi-references. We're going to do this by looking at the straightforward relationship between books and authors. So obviously books have authors, authors write books, and we're going to start with the most basic levels where we're going to use joins, and we're going to look at why that isn't really an effective solution and why we could perhaps use subtables, and then again recognize that even subtables are not the ideal solution. We're going to be looking at the multi-reference. So I'm going to start with some basic test data. I've got that up on screen now. We're going to have 4 books. So each book has a unique ID as per relational database requirement. They have a title, and then we have an author ID where we can input the ID of the author who wrote that book, and that is a foreign key to the primary keys over here in the author table where we have 3 authors. So you'll see that we have 4 books, but one of those books doesn't have an author because it's not finished yet, let's say. And we also have 3 authors, and one of those authors, author number 3, George, does not actually have a book yet because he's actually busy with the JavaScript primer at the minute, but it's not completed. What we're going to do is going to build on that very simple data set and look at how we can update and upgrade those relationships to be able to allow us to more effectively manage the information and its relationships with it. So our first thing that we'll be looking at will be a straightforward inner join. We're going to be looking at joining our book table to our author table. We're going to be creating this within our query editor, and we're going to be looking at the output of that. Now I'm going to use that format throughout. I'm not going to use a screen like this on each occasion, but we will be looking at particularly at this output screen and what that data will look like coming out of the server actions that we will be writing. So here we are now in Wappler. I'm running actually on a different server to that which our different setup that I was for the community web. We're still in a Node server. I'm actually using WAMP as opposed to SQLite on this particular occasion. I will explain why later in this module. And if we go into our database manager, we'll see I've already pre-created those 2 tables, our author table and our book table. Have a look at our books. We can have a look at the data that's in there. And we see there that we have our books as we described before, and we have our author IDs over here. I'll just drag that across and you might be able to see it a little better. Book IDs, titles, and our author IDs, and we're exactly the same in our author table. If we look at our data in the author table, we can see we have our 3 authors as before. And what we're going to do is we're going to start building on this and looking at how the different data interactions work within relational databases. So I'm going to start with a very simple one that we saw first. We're going to start with our inner join. So I'm going to create an API action and we're going to call this inner. And this is going to be a very simple action. We're going to add an action in here. It's going to be a database query. And our query will be a query on the book table, and we're going to join it to the authors table. We're going to use an inner join on this occasion, and that join obviously is author ID to author ID. So what do we want to see? The book ID and its title, and we'll see the author ID and his name. Okay. Let's save that action. Let's fire that up in the browser. And for some bizarre reason we haven't got any output. I'm just going to restart that server again. Let's try that again. And yeah, we've got it. What I find is I tend to switch between targets quite a lot when I'm doing these videos. And I think sometimes when you switch too often between targets, the server stalls. It's not a problem. You just stop and restart it, and we can see that everything's fine. It's important that you understand that when these glitches happen, they are very, very simple to resolve. And if we look now, we have our joins. We have Wappler for Dummies by Brian English, CSS Masterclass by Ben, the CSS Master, and also SQL for Dummies by myself. And if you think back to the data we had there, you'll notice that there is no sign of that JavaScript primer, and there is no mention of George, because there can be no join, because the author to author ID links between the two tables could not be made, and therefore those records will be ignored in their entirety. So let's go back now, and what we're going to do now is look at the left join. So I'm going to add an API action. I'll just call this left. Not like that, I won't. Left action, and in this case we're going to do exactly the same, but we're going to do a left join, and I'll explain what a left join is as we go along. So we've got this database query, and we've got our book, and we're going to link it to an author through a left join. If you can imagine, might make it simpler. I know this is top and bottom, but think of this as the left and this is the right. So a left join basically says, give me everything in the left table and all of the link data from the right table. However, if there is no match between the two, still create the record, but insert nulls in the place of the data that is missing. So if we go into book ID, title, author ID and name, save that, say we're on a left join now, and I lift that in the browser, what we'll see now is that we have the same data as before, Wappler for Dummies, SQL for Dummies, CSS Masterclass, but you'll see it's actually now included that JavaScript primer, because that's on the left hand side of the join, and has simply added nulls in place of the missing elements. So that's a useful way of being able to pull that information in without losing those records. It also gives us another clever little feature, in that if we wanted to find all of the books which do not have an author, I'm just going to first of all duplicate that, and I'm going to rename it left missing. What we're going to do is we're now going to amend this query slightly to find all of the entries which do not have an author. So we're actually using a query to find something that's missing. Now it's really easy, because all we do is we say, well, where the author ID is null. If we've still got it there, you'll remember that data that we called it before, author ID and name for the person who does the book that does not have an author is null. So by setting that condition, if we save that and run that one, we'll see that it finds the fact that JavaScript primer is a book which has no author. And we can do the opposite with that in a right join. Now, that's why I'm running in a WAMP server rather than MySQL. Right joins are very rarely used in truth, and actually they are not supported by SQLite. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what a right join would look like, explain what it is, and then I'm going to explain a little workaround to get around the basics of that. So I'm going to add an API action. We're going to call that right. I'm going to create our query. Query builder, and what we're going to do is we're going to exactly as before, book, and then we're going to add author, but we're going to create a right join instead. So what does that mean? Remember the analogy we used before? This is the left, this is the right. What it will give us is all of the authors, regardless of whether they have a match or not, and the related book data or nulls. So let's try that again. We've got our author ID, title, sorry, book ID we wanted, and name. I'll just move that up there. Okay, that. Let's save and let's fire that up. And for some reason that hasn't worked. Give me a second. We'll just have a quick look at that query. Book ID, book title, author ID, author name. We've got a right join. Has that server stalled again? Let's just try that. Let's fire it up. Yeah, again, we've had a server stall. I don't know whether that's my machine or whether it's a little problem with Wappler, but it is happening from time to time. And you'll see on this occasion we've got our 3 entries where there is a match, but in this case we've actually now see George jumps into the ring because he's an author. He was in that right hand table, but George as yet has not written a book. Now it's a little bit of a problem obviously that we don't have right joins in SQLite. So what we'll do is we'll just simulate that, and actually we can do it really easily. If we add our action, we can then go into our database action, our database query, and all we actually do is we turn the tables round. So we start with author and we left join the book, and that has exactly the same effect as the right joining the books to the authors. So let's pop in our book ID and title, our author ID and author name. Let's OK that. Fire that up, and there we are. You see, we've got exactly the same data as we got with that right join, and we've done that just simply by transposing the tables. May I also just point out that with our left missing action, you can do exactly the same with the right action. You can specify where the book ID is null, and it will show you all of the authors who do not have a book. That's all very well, but authors write more than one book quite often, and books can have more than one author. So this doesn't really work very well, because if we just simply go into our data and say, okay, well, we'll add another author in. Look at our data here, and let's say that George is also going to write, co-write a book with me. So we're going to book. If I go into create new, and I add a new record in there, and that's going to be also Wappler for Dummies. You can see already why this is getting scrappy, and the author ID is author 3, which is George. We'll save that. We'll go back into our inner join. We'll run that. Yeah, okay, we've got a duplicated entry here. We've got this in twice, and that's not really what we want. Yeah, we can see that I've written Wappler for Dummies, and as has George, but what we really want is one entry for the Wappler for Dummies, but multiple entries for the authors, and that's where our subtables come in. So firstly, I'm just going to get rid of that extra bit of data that I've just added in the author table. Sorry, in the book table, my apologies. I'm going to delete that entry. Sorry, I forgot to do a a refetch before I deleted that entry. So back to where we were now. We've got the 4 books. We've got our 3 authors as we want. We're going to our data tables now. Actually, what we want to be able to do is allocate more than one author to a book. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that through a subtable. So I'm going to do, first of all, you'll see we've got basic, advanced up here. I would recommend, if you're working with subtables or multi-references, put yourself in the advanced mode, because that will allow you to see exactly what's going on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a subtable to this book. I'm going to call that creator. It's created an ID for you automatically. Let's just prefix that, as I like to do, as you know. We have a book ID, which is the key to match our books, and then we want to add a name field, so we can add the name of that author to that book. I'm going to commit that change. I'm going to do that, and now we can look at adding our creator data. So now we've got our book with our creator subtable. If I now view that data, and obviously in the real world we'll be programmatically adding this data, I'm doing it manually for demonstration purposes. What we can do now is we can say, right, well, book number 1 was written by Brian English. Book number 2 was written by Ben. Book number 3 was written by Brian English. And of course book number 4 has no author. So let's save that. Let's go back into our actions. Just going to remove that, that's old. Let's add an action, and let's call it subtable. What we're going to do now is we're going to create an API action as before, straightforward. We're going to create a database query, and from that database query we're going to pull all of those book entries in, and we want to know the book ID and the title at this stage. So how do we tag those creators, those authors onto that? Well, what we do is we click on this icon here, which shows that this is a table that will add an entry in here, and then we click that entry, and that will open a completely new query builder screen. And from there we simply want the name of the person who created that book. So if we save that now and we run that action, what we see now is a little bit more like what we wanted. We can see Wappler for Dummies created by Brian, CSS Masterclass Ben, SQL Dummies Brian, JavaScript Primer appears in here now. So it's done a little bit like the left join would have done before, but that has no creator. So now I'm going to go back in, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to adjust that data. We're going to go into the creator table. I'm going to add new entry, and I'm going to say that book number 4 was written by George. And I'm also going to make George a co-author of Wappler for Dummies. Save that. If we now go back into our subtable query and run that, now we're starting to see the whole structure starting to pull together quite nicely. Now we have our 4 books shown. We have, in this case, showing we've got effectively a subtable there of authors, showing that myself and George wrote that book. Ben's still the author of the masterclass. we've got me, the author of SQL for Dummies, and George now has completed his book JavaScript Primer. So that shows you the subtables and how we can create multiple authors onto a book. But of course that's still not enough, is it? Because we still had to manually type the full name of the author into the table. If we look at, basic relational database rules, we should not have repeating entities. What we should actually have is we should be linking that subtable to another ID. So when you think about a subtable that's linked to another ID, what we now end up with is a multi-reference. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into my table, and I'm actually going to delete that creator table completely because we do not need that anymore. While we're busy, I'm also going to remove that author ID entry, which is totally redundant now, and to be honest, it will end up causing problems later. We're going to end up with too many different fields all called author ID. We need to minimize that as far as possible. So let's delete that as well. Let's commit that change. Okay, so that's a change made. So now we're back to our structure where we have two tables. One table contains nothing more than a book ID and a title of the book, and the other has nothing more than the name of the author and their ID. So we're going to go to the book table now. We're still in advanced mode, and we're actually now going to create a multi-reference, and we're going to call that creator still, want of a better name. Now what we're effectively doing is creating a central table which has nothing other than a link between a book and an author. So that creator table needs to have the book ID, which links to the book, but we also need a new reference, and that reference will be to the author ID. We need to set that down here, so we need to tell it that points to the authors table, and it's picked up that it's the author ID field that is required. We can at this stage also set delete actions and update actions, the cascade actions within the database. So we could say if that entry is deleted, delete everything else in relation to that author. But we don't want to do that. Let's keep things simple. So we're going to apply that change, add multi, and now we have that multi table. So let's go back into our API actions and let's see how we can deal with that within a query. So now we've got our query. We're going to add our action. Sorry, because first of all we're going to actually have to add some data, aren't we? So my apologies, I'm going to go into the creators table. We're going to view our action, and right, now all we've got to do now is put in those links. Book ID 1 was written by author 1. Again, obviously, remember, this will be done by a query, an insert query or an update query normally. Book number 2 is written by author number 2. So I've also put 11 in there, which is wrong. Excuse me. Let's add a new entry. Book number 3 is written by author number 1. Then we said book number 4 was written by George, so that is author number 3, and then George is also added me on Wappler for Dummies. So you see now all we've done is we've defined links between those book and author entities. We haven't actually added any new data as such. We haven't had any names or titles. All we've done is created a table of links. And if I save that, now we can go into our API action. We had our multi-action I just created before there. Add table, database query, our query builder, and let's start with our book in this case, because we want the book title. We're going to add that creators link and open that up. And now we see that it's showing us just the links. And what we do now is we add a join. There'll be an inner join to our authors table, linked on author ID. And now we can add that name of the author in there. That's all we need to do. Really, really simple. If we save that now and we fire up that action, now we can see that we've got the data as we wanted, and we can see that the creators have got their books with their authors, and we can actually do that in reverse if we want. We could actually then go, right, well, okay, well, what about looking at authors? Sorry about this. We want to look at from an author's perspective and see which books a particular author has written. So again, very simple. We start with our API action, our query builder. In this case, we're going to add the author table, and then our creators. We'll open that. We then link that to our book table as an inner join, add our title, save that, and now we should have a list of authors showing which books those authors have written. So there we are. Brian English has written Wappler for Dummies and SQL for Dummies. Ben's got CSA Masterclass, and George has also got the JavaScript Primer and the Wappler for Dummies. So in this module, just to recap, what we've done is we've looked at our basic joins between a book and an author. We've looked at how those joins work, our inner join, our left join, our right join. We've also looked at the limitations of joins and why they're not always the solution. We've looked at subtables, which are a really good solution where you have a single entity with multiple related entities. Classic example would be perhaps an item within a checkout where you have the description of an item, but you want multiple pictures. Then you would use those subtables to be able to hold the image names of those images. Perfect place where you would use the subtables, and then you get the the upgraded version, shall we say, of the multi-relation, where we can actually create one-to-many relationships in both directions from table to table, which is an immensely powerful feature, which is to say relatively new now to Wappler, and I think quite a few people have struggled to get their head around it, and I hope that this video has clarified the difference and how to use those different forms of query. So that ends this particular session. I'm going to be going back now to our community web, and I'm going to be looking at creating, deleting and adding roles to people who are registered on the system to give them different permissions within the web application. So I hope you'll join me in the next module.